Okay, so one of our listeners wrote in with a really interesting question about jinn
Okay.
and what the Quran says about them
Oh, okay.
and, these unseen forces
Yeah.
and how they might connect to, like, the strange things that people report experiencing these days today.
Okay.
So that's what we're going to deep dive into today.
So good.
And to help us navigate this, we're going to be taking a look at this YouTube discussion with Imran Hussein,
Right.
who is a scholar in Islamic studies.
Yeah.
And he talks quite a bit about jinn and their place in Islam.
Nice.
So our mission for this deep dive is to kind of pull out like the core insights about jinn from that Islamic tradition and see how that perspective might like illuminate things like paranormal activity,
Right.
even UFO sightings,
Yeah.
all that stuff that gets people thinking about the deeper reality.
Interesting.
So
Do it.
let's get into it. So
Yeah.
from an Islamic perspective, what are jinn exactly?
Well, jinn, the word itself in Arabic refers to something that is hidden, something that is unseen, something that exists in a realm that we can't normally see or touch.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting to contrast that with like a purely modern secular viewpoint,
Uh-huh.
which often focuses only on the physical realm
Okay.
and what's observable. But as your question shows, a lot of people are kind of like, they're searching beyond that.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
There's more than meets the eye, as they say.
That's right.
So if they're unseen, like how do they even come about?
Yeah. Yeah.
What's their origin story according to Islam?
So in Islam, it's believed that jinn were actually created before humans.
Really?
And they were created from something called smokeless fire.
Smokeless fire.
Now, some people have speculated that the smokeless fire could potentially be something like plasma.
Interesting.
Like what we see in lightning or the sun.
Okay.
Which are states of matter that are really quite different from what we encounter every day.
Right.
And this contrasts with humans being created from clay and angels being created from light, according to the Quran.
Okay, so smokeless fire plasma, like that kind of paints a picture of something that is like totally other.
Yeah.
So were they just created and that was it? Or like,
Right.
what's their nature?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And here's the thing about jinn. They have free will.
Okay.
Just like humans.
Oh, well.
They're not like angels who are generally seen as beings who are, constantly in obedience to God's commands.
Right.
Jinn have the capacity to choose between good and evil.
So like us then.
Exactly.
Which kind of brings us to a huge figure in all of this. Iblis, also known as Shaitan.
Yeah.
So what's his origin story in this whole picture?
Yeah, so Iblis actually began as a jinn named El. And through his intense devotion to God, he actually rose in rank among the angels.
Oh, wow.
And worshipped alongside them. So it's important to remember that jinn are distinct from angels. They're a different type of creation.
So he was a jinn, but he was up there with the angels because of his devotion.
Yeah, he was that devout.
Okay, so how did El go from like worshiping with angels to being Shaitan?
Right.
Like what happened?
So the big turning point was the creation of Adam, the first human.
Okay.
And God commanded all the angels and El, who was among them, to prostrate before Adam.
Okay.
Now, this prostration was a sign of respect, not worship.
Right.
But El refused.
Oh.
Out of pride and arrogance. He said, I am better than him. I am made of fire while he is made of clay.
What a statement.
Yeah, it was pure arrogance.
So that was it. That was his downfall.
That was the turning point.
It kind of set him on this path.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That disobedience led to him being cast out, and he became known as Shaitan, the evil one, the accursed one.
Okay.
And from that point on, his sole aim is to mislead humanity,
Right.
to divert us from the path of righteousness.
So he was not only evil himself, but he wants to make everyone else evil too.
Exactly.
Well,
And that's actually a really important point that Imran Hussein emphasizes.
okay.
Just as there is good and bad among humans, there are also good and bad jinn.
Right.
So the term shaitan that we use isn't limited to just jinn.
All right.
The Quran also uses it to describe evil humans.
So it's more like a descriptor.
Exactly. It's more a description of evil than like a category of being.
Okay, that makes sense. So
Yes.
how do these bad jinn led by Shaitan actually try to mess with us,
Right.
like in our daily lives?
So the main way they do this is through something called waswasa,
Waswas.
which is basically the whispering or implanting of negative thoughts.
Oh.
So Shaitan and his crew, they try to influence us towards like negative emotions, greed, anger, envy,
Uh-huh.
and they tempt us to act on those impulses.
It's like that little voice
Yeah, it's like that voice inside your head.
that tells you to do bad things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it kind of aligns with the idea that not all of our thoughts originate within our own minds. There's this idea in many spiritual traditions about this external influence
Yeah.
that can subtly guide our thinking.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier, like certain places giving you bad vibes.
Right.
Some Islamic perspectives would say that this could be linked to the presence of these negative jinn.
Yeah, I've definitely felt that before.
Yeah.
Okay, so Islam also talks about like a spiritual sense, right?
Yes.
How does that fit into this whole unseen realm?
So, in Islam, the practice of prayer, which is called salah,
Right.
it's seen as a direct spiritual connection with God.
Okay.
It's not just about physical movements, but an engagement of the soul, like tuning in to a different level of reality.
I see.
And this contrasts with just purely physical interactions.
Okay.
And it suggests we have a capacity to perceive things beyond just our five senses.
So if these unseen forces exist, do they have like certain abilities or ways they could show up in our world?
Yeah, definitely. Islamic narrations actually describe jinn as having the ability to shapeshift.
Whoa.
And the Prophet Muhammad mentioned three main categories, and these
Fine.
aren't necessarily exhaustive, but
Fine.
there are those that fly.
Okay.
Those that appear as dogs and snakes.
Dogs and snakes? That's so specific.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
And those that are constantly moving, coming and going.
Coming and going. Like that's
Yeah.
instantaneous travel almost.
It's like a mode of existence beyond our normal understanding of space and time.
It's like interdimensional or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
And on top of that, there are also traditions that mention jinn taking on human forms. And Imran Hussein makes this really interesting point.
Yeah.
It's a bit speculative, but he says that it's possible for jinn to maybe even appear as public figures in our modern world.
That's mind-blowing.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
So this shape-shifting thing, could that be like a possible explanation for some of the unexplained stuff we see?
Yeah, it's definitely a connection worth exploring. I mean, if jinn can manifest in all these different forms, then it could offer like a framework for understanding some paranormal events and even aspects of the UFO phenomenon.
Right.
The strange lights, the bizarre creatures that people report seeing.
Yeah. You mentioned UFOs earlier.
Right.
Before we get deeper into that, you also said that other cultures have like similar beings
Yes.
in their own folklore and stuff.
That's right. And this is really important to consider across many world religions and cultures throughout history. You find descriptions of beings that are neither gods nor humans.
Okay.
They exist in this intermediary realm.
Yeah.
And they possess these abilities that are really comparable to what's attributed to jinn.
Right.
You think about Irish fairies, Native American skinwalkers, different names, different cultural interpretations, but perhaps pointing to the same underlying reality.
This is like humanity has always had this sense of something more.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
beyond what we can immediately see. Okay, so you mentioned King Solomon
Yeah.
and his interactions with jinn. That sounds like a big example of what they can do.
Yeah, definitely. So the Quran recounts how King Solomon was given power over the jinn.
Wow.
And they weren't just like purely evil forces. They served him in all sorts of ways as builders, divers, undertaking all these different tasks. There's one really interesting story about the Queen of Sheba's throne.
Oh, yeah.
So this powerful jinn, this Ifrit, he offered to transport this huge throne to Solomon before you rise from your seat.
Whoa.
Another jinn who had even deeper knowledge was like, no, I can do it faster.
Wow.
So it really highlights their potential to like manipulate space and time
Right.
in ways that resonate with our modern ideas of teleportation or even interdimensional beings.
Yeah, like when people talk about ancient astronauts helping to build the pyramids.
Exactly.
The Quran's like, hey, maybe it was these powerful unseen beings.
Yeah, maybe it was these jinn.
That's so cool. So we've got like construction, seafaring, potentially bending space and time. That's a lot.
That's a wide range of abilities.
Okay, so let's talk about the darker side again.
Sure.
What's the link between jinn and like occult practices?
Well, both historically and in the present day, you see this link between jinn or entities that are similar to jinn in various cultures. And these occult practices, and these practices often involve trying to communicate with, influence, or even control these unseen beings.
So is that something that Islam is like, hey, go for it? Or is it like, don't do that.
Well, Islam very much advises against seeking contact with jinn, especially the malevolent ones.
Okay.
The Quran emphasizes seeking refuge and guidance only from God,
Right.
and engaging with jinn, especially through occult, means often involves what Imran Hussein describes as sacrifice and degradation of the human self.
Oh, wow.
You know, these beings, especially the negative ones, they don't just offer assistance out of the goodness of their hearts.
Right.
There's always a price.
Like a deal with the devil kind of thing.
Exactly. And that price can be devastating spiritually.
Yeah, so all those stories of people making pacts and stuff.
Yeah,
It's a consistent theme.
it is.
So what about people today who claim to have these connections?
Right.
Are they all just like faking it?
Well, there are definitely people who falsely claim these connections and, you know, they exploit people's beliefs.
Right.
But the possibility of some people genuinely engaging with jinn does exist.
Okay.
However, from an Islamic perspective, this often comes at a huge spiritual cost.
Right.
And it involves acts that are considered morally wrong.
So you mentioned Aleister Crowley before.
Yes.
And his contact with Lamb.
Right.
How does he fit into all this?
So Aleister Crowley was this really influential occultist in the 20th century.
Right.
And he claimed to have contact with an entity called Lamb. And what's really interesting and relevant to our discussion about UFOs is that the way Crowley described Lamb visually,
Yeah.
it looks a lot like the gray aliens that people describe in UFO encounters.
Wow.
And this similarity has led some people to speculate on a potential connection between these types of beings
Oh, wow.
across different belief systems.
So from the Islamic perspective, why would these evil jinn want to get humans to do bad stuff?
Well, their motivation aligns with Shaitan's ultimate goal,
Right.
to lead humanity away from God.
Okay.
By tempting humans to do evil, they're trying to corrupt us, to break our connection with the divine.
And ultimately...
Yeah, and ultimately to drag us down with them.
Okay, so it all comes back to that original conflict, like
Yeah.
that fundamental choice
Exactly.
between good and evil.
Well, yeah.
So let's bring this into the modern day with like UFOs and UAPs.
Right.
There's been like a huge increase in interest in that recently.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Over the past few years, we've seen a huge surge in interest in UAPs, both from the public and even from governments.
Right.
It's not this fringe topic anymore.
And it's interesting because you mentioned before like some early interpretations of UFOs
Yeah.
within like certain Christian viewpoints saw them as being like demonic.
Yes, back in the 1950s,
Okay.
some Christians thought that UFOs might be demons or fallen angels.
Wow.
And this just goes to show how different religious frameworks try to understand these non-human intelligences. And the Islamic understanding with its concept of jinn offers another perspective.
Right. So what about Jacques Vallée?
Yeah.
He's a name that comes up a lot in UFO circles. Right.
What does he think about all this?
Jacques Vallée is a really respected ufologist, like a pioneer in the field.
Yeah.
And his conclusion after years of research is that the UFO phenomenon is likely not extraterrestrial in origin.
Okay, so he doesn't think it's aliens.
Not in the conventional sense.
Okay.
Like beings from another planet traveling vast distances. He points to things like the low probability of advanced alien spacecraft constantly crashing, and the fact that these reports have been around for centuries, way before modern space travel.
So if he doesn't think they're aliens, what does he think?
Right, so this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because when you consider what's called the hitchhiker effect,
Hitchhiker effect.
which is associated with UFO experiences, it starts to sound a lot like what we've been talking about with Jinn.
Okay.
So the hitchhiker effect is this thing where people who have UFO encounters, or even people who just study them closely, they start experiencing all these strange events.
It affects them, their families, their surroundings. You know, people like Lou Elizondo and Jim Summivan have talked about weird stuff happening after they got involved in UAP research.
That's creepy.
It's kind of unsettling to think that there might be these unseen forces messing with us.
Yeah, so it's like they get these negative attachments
Exactly.
just from like interacting with this negative stuff.
Yeah.
So besides the hitchhiker effect, what are some other similarities between Jinn and UFOs?
There are quite a few similarities, actually. For one thing, the way they look.
Okay.
You know, reports of unexplained lights, orbs, weird creatures in the sky.
Yeah.
That's pretty much how Jinn are said to manifest.
Right.
And the classic gray alien looks a lot like Crowley's drawing of Lamb,
Right.
which we talked about maybe being a Jinn.
So it's like we're seeing the same thing,
Yeah,
but through different lenses.
exactly.
Okay.
Then there's the whole abduction thing.
Right.
We talked about the story from the time of Caliph Omar, And there are similarities between modern alien abductions and those old stories about jinn abducting people.
Oh, wow.
And then there's the deception and misinformation.
Okay.
Just like Shaitan and the evil jinn are known for deceiving people, the entities that people encounter in UFO experiences often give out weird, confusing, or just plain false information.
That's so interesting.
It's almost as if we're looking at the same basic phenomenon, but through different cultural and technological filters.
Yeah, it's like our modern understanding is just like a new way of interpreting something ancient.
Exactly. And it's not just based on stories either.
Okay.
There was an article published on ResearchGate that looked at the possibility of magical entities,
Right.
including Jinn, as an explanation for some UAP encounters.
Wow.
And the article suggested that the whole alien hypothesis might be too narrow.
Okay, so that brings us back to our listener's question
Yeah.
about these connections.
Yeah.
So if these negative influences are real, how do we protect ourselves?
Well, the most important thing is to seek refuge and protection from God.
Okay.
Shaitan and the evil jinn might be powerful,
Right.
but they have no power over God.
Yeah.
So turning to God through sincere faith is the ultimate shield.
Are there any specific verses or practices that are good for protection?
Yes. There's a verse in the Quran called Ayat al-Kursi,
Okay.
which is considered very powerful for warding off evil.
Wow.
There's even a story about how Shaitan himself admitted that this verse is effective.
Really?
So Muslims are encouraged to recite it regularly, like before going to sleep or whenever they feel the need for protection.
So it sounds like knowledge, understanding, and faith are like the best tools for dealing with this unseen world.
Definitely. The Quran mentions jinn quite a bit.
Right.
It acknowledges their existence, and it reminds us that both humans and jinn are meant to worship God. So approaching these topics from a place of faith and knowledge, rather than fear, is really important.
Right.
You know, we might not fully grasp the unseen realms and the nature of time, but these stories that cultures have been telling for centuries,
Right.
they suggest that there's a deeper reality out there that goes beyond our current scientific understanding.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing all this with us.
You're welcome. It's a topic that raises so many questions.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
to our listener, we hope you found this helpful.
Yeah.
Think about what we've discussed and consider that maybe there are unseen forces at work in ways that we don't fully understand.
It's a possibility.
Given all these stories and similarities across cultures,
Right.
could it be that our obsession with UFOs and aliens is actually just a modern take on something ancient?
It's a thought-provoking idea.
And if that's true, then what does it say about our reality?
Yeah, what does it all mean?
So keep exploring these ideas
Yeah,
and let us know what you think.
that's right.
We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks.
We'll catch you next time.
See you then. Bye.